Hello and welcome to this videocast and podcast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Bit of a different location this week and for the next few weeks because I'm in Australia, Perth at the moment, on a speaking tour. But even from this distance across the other side of the world, I can smell the stench of what has been going on with Tony Blair and the Chilcot report and all that's come out with that. And also the way Hillary Clinton has been protected from prosecution by the system that she serves in the form of the FBI. And in so many ways, those two stories are connected. It's been said that the Chilcot report was damning. And in terms of Blair, on one level, it was, but only up to a point. It's very noticeable to me, anyway, that the report went so far because there's no way that this guy Chilcot was going to be able to not heavily criticize Blair. Too much has come out already about what went on in the run-up and subsequent invasion of Iraq in 2003. So there's no way he could stand up and say didn't find anything. So he had to be damning on one level, or his credibility would have been down the plug hole. But what it seems to me, he's gone so far, but then seriously stopped when entering any area that would provide an open and shut case for prosecution of Blair. And if you notice, I sat here the other night and watched the press conference of the head of the FBI talking about Hillary Clinton and this email security scandal. And he was damning in many ways because he could not have, he couldn't have been not damning because his credibility would have been down the same plug hole. So he's going on about all these things that were done that shouldn't have been done in terms of classified emails on our own server, etc., of Hillary Clinton. But then, just like Chilcot, stopped before entering that realm where she should be prosecuted. So it wasn't so much what was in the Chilcot report for me. It was what was not in it. And what was not in it was never going to be in it because that would have gone into realms where people like public servants like Chilcot, actually system servants like Chilcot, were never going to go. So I'm just going to go through the story, which I've been researching now ever since it happened, and fill in what Chilcot didn't say, and therefore put what he did say into a completely different context, and also put into a context Blair's press conference reply, which I also watched here with my head shaking and my stomach not feeling very nice. It goes a long way back, but let's pick it up in September 2000. That was the month when an organization in America called the Project for the New American Century, known as neocons, neoconservatives, produced a document demanding that the United States fight, quote, multiple theater wars to regime change country after country. The countries they listed included Iraq, Libya, Syria, and others, and included a desire for regime change in China. So, who were these people? Well, they included Donald Rumsfeld, who a few months later would come to power with the Boy Bush administration as Defense Secretary. They included Paul Wolfowitz, who became Deputy Defense Secretary. They included Dov Zakheim, who became the comptroller in charge of the entire Pentagon budget. And they included people like Robert Kagan and William Crystal, co-founders of this project for the New American Century. And many other people, Richard Pearl, who were the power in the Bush administration or in the background of the Bush administration, which came to power in January 2001. Also in this document, in September 2000, was the point that this process of transformation they were calling for, in other words, this regime change of country after country with multiple theatre wars, would be slow in happening, absent, this is the quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. So they come to power a few months later, and 9 months after they came to power, 1 year to the month after they produced that document, the United States had what Boy Bush called the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century. As a result of that, they have launched into this so-called war on terror, war of terror, in which they've been picking off country after country on that very list that they published in September 2000. And of course, on that list was Iraq. Then we move to General Wesley Clark, former NATO Supreme Commander. He went on a television program in 2007, kind of an alternative TV program. And he described what he experienced immediately after 9/11. A 9/11 official story, of course, that is a nonsense and obviously, clearly, is not what happened and what was behind it. Anyway, Wesley Clark told this television program that a few days after 9/11, he was at the Pentagon, controlled now by these neocons from the Project for the New American Century. And he met Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, and then met a general he knew in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as they call them. And he said this general told him, this is a few days after 9/11, that they were going to invade Iraq. No one's mentioned this in public. I mean, we're talking about 2001. So he said, why are we going to invade Iraq? And the general said, I don't know. Maybe we want to respond basically to 9/11, and that's all we know what to do. So Clark goes away, and he said he came back some weeks later, just a few weeks later, by which time the United States was invading Afghanistan. And he said he met the same general, the Pentagon, and said, why aren't we invading Iraq? I thought we were going to invade Iraq. And he said, the general said, it's worse than that, sir. And he picked up a piece of paper and he said, "We've just had this from upstairs. We're going to invade 7 countries in 5 years." And those countries included Iraq, Libya, Syria, and others. And so what Clark told this program is that basically there had been a coup by this Project for the New American Century. And they were going to turn these countries over so that they could take them over, take over the Middle East. So within a few days of September or 9/11 in September 2001, Clark was told the plan was to invade Iraq. This week, after the Chilcot report, a man called Admiral Lord West, who was a former First Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff in Britain, told Channel 4 News that he was told in 2002 that Britain was going to invade Iraq with the United States. Long before the invasion actually took place in 2003, it was all planned to happen because they were going to pick this list off of countries for regime change. And so when Blair is going on about getting UN resolutions and what a good job he did to get the Americans to seek a UN resolution, this was not to in any way stop the invasion. It was to find a way of justifying it to the British Parliament and the British people. Because this was always going to happen. And Blair knows this. All this stuff going on to justify what happened. He knew all this. And so when they were saying in the run-up to the war, look, if Saddam will comply, then this war doesn't have to happen. Absolute lies. It was always going to happen for these reasons. And of course, when you're trying to pick off a list of countries for regime change, and you haven't got a good enough excuse to do it, then what do? You make them up. And that's where weapons of mass destruction came from. It was just a made-up lie to justify the invasion and ticking countries off this list. So when Sir John Chilcot, in this damning report, talks about Blair and Cup having genuinely held views, they were genuinely held views. They were following a script. And that Blair did not improperly influence the intelligence. Nonsense! Why has there been so much controversy over the dossier produced by British intelligence? A contradiction in terms, to justify the war. Because Chilcot even is saying that there was no justification at that time for a war. And this so-called dodgy dossier produced by British intelligence to justify the war, which had Tony Blair standing up in Parliament, lying through his teeth about Saddam having the capability of unleashing weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes. This dossier was a pack of bloody lies and made up stories because it had one purpose and one purpose alone, and that was to justify the invasion and pick off a country on the list because they never had a real reason and a good reason to do it. And when they talk about here the dossier and not being improperly influenced and all this stuff, this is a story from the Guardian newspaper dated February the 7th, 2003. Headline: UK war dossier a sham, say experts. Downing Street was last night plunged into acute international embarrassment after it emerged that large parts of the British government's latest dossier on Iraq, allegedly based on intelligence material, were taken from published academic articles, some of them several years old. They did a cut and paste job just to give something to keep the population happy. Oh, see, it's right. Cut and pasted it. Amid charges of scandalous plagiarism on the night when Tony Blair attempted to rally support for the US-led campaign against Saddam Hussein, Whitehall's dismay was compounded by the knowledge that the disputed document was singled out for praise by the US Secretary of State Colin Powell in his speech to the UN Security Council on Wednesday. See, what's happening is the British government, led by Blair, not the British government, it wasn't the British government, there was no cabinet government. The British representatives of the global cabal, called Tony Blair and co., their job was to produce, quote, intelligence to justify to Parliament and justify to the public this invasion of Iraq, which has been long planned and was always going to happen, whatever. And Colin Powell was doing the same at the UN on behalf of America. And ironically, he is quoting to support his case for invasion of Iraq, cut and pasted stuff produced by the British intelligence and the Blair cabal within the British government. Here we go. This is talking about a Powell at the UN, citing the British dossier entitled "Iraq: Its Infrastructure of Concealment, Deception and Intimidation," in front of a worldwide television audience. Mr. Powell said, "I would call my colleagues' attention to this fine paper, cut and pasted off the internet, that the United Kingdom distributed, which describes in exquisite detail Iraqi deception activities." This describes in exquisite details the American British government's deception activities. But this article says, on Channel 4 News last night, it was revealed that 4 of the report's 19 pages had been copied with only minor editing and a few insertions from the internet version of an article by Ibrahim al-Marashi, which appeared in the Middle East Review of International Affairs last September. This is written, obviously, in 2003. Though that was not the only textual embarrassment, Number 10 seemed determined to tough it out last night. In other words, well, we cut and paste it, don't matter. So here we have a thread where the decision was made before 9/11. Back in September 2000, it first came to light, but it would have been made long before that they were going to invade these countries and they were going to invade Iraq. Then they got their excuse to start this war on terror, start picking these countries off in September 2001 with 9/11. And then they had to find the excuses through 2001, 2002, to the invasion in 2003 to justify what they were going to do anyway. And of course, the preparations had to start being made at some, at least higher levels, for what they knew was coming. And this is why Sorry about that. The computer went off. Anyway, never mind. Technology. So this is why the former First Sea Lord, this guy, Admiral Lewis, said he knew about and was told about the invasion of Iraq with the Americans in 2002. It's because it was all in the planning. And Tony Blair didn't know that. I mean, what? Of course he knew that. Because he knew it was going to happen. And so when we look at this other aspect of this story, not mentioned by Chilcot, they were selling a lie to justify an invasion. But there was a man called Dr. David Kelly, a British weapons inspector, who knew they weren't telling the truth. And he spoke to a BBC reporter and said that the dossier had been sexed up. In other words, it wasn't the truth. And he knew that because he'd visited Iraq many times. He knew what the situation was there. And his name eventually came out as the source of that BBC report. And he was vilified by the establishment. And the situation was still, however, that he had the knowledge to demolish the dossier of nonsense. And he then went for a walk in the woods from his home in that period and never came back. He was supposed to have committed suicide, but as one group of doctors alone have pointed out, the official story of how he committed suicide is basically a medical impossibility. They killed him because this war, this invasion of Iraq, was going to happen and nothing was going to stop it. And this is the reason why, as Chilcot pointed out, you had a situation where there was no cabinet government. Blair and a few people around him were doing all the decision making because they had to keep from the cabinet, as they did from Parliament and the public in general, the information that would have got them to oppose the war, oppose the invasion. So it was all done in a little group, and excluded even the cabinet of the British government from so much information, and kept them out the loop, so that this invasion that was never not going to happen happened. And so Chilcot went so far, but no further. And he did mention one area, and that was the decision by the British Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, in the end, that going to war with Iraq would be legal under international law. However, the first response from Goldsmith was that it wouldn't be legal. And then suddenly, just in time, he changes his mind and says, oh, actually, it would be legal. Nothing's changed, only his mind. Why? Because they needed that Attorney General opinion that the war was legal to justify the war and dilute opposition. And so Goldsmith changed his mind miraculously, and suddenly a war he thought was illegal suddenly became legal. And the common theme of all this, which pulls it all together, is that this war was going to happen, this invasion of Iraq was going to happen, and nothing was going to stop it. So anything or anyone who got in the way was going to be dealt with in some way or other, and any problem was going to be dealt with. Now, like I say, Chilcot went so far in his report in having a go at Blair, basically, but not so far that there was an open and shut case for prosecution. And I personally don't believe that that is a coincidence. So we had the catastrophe that was Iraq, and it has cost the lives of staggering numbers of people and destroyed the lives of staggering numbers of people. And it created the upheaval in the Middle East, which has led to the ongoing catastrophe. But Blair held a news conference, an excuse conference, on the day of Chilcot, and tried to explain away the appalling things that he did. And one of them, somehow, was that the world is now a safer place with Saddam gone than it would have been had he still been there. Well, has anyone seen the Middle East? It's torn asunder, and it's been gathering ever since the invasion of Iraq. He talks about fighting terrorism when he was warned, the Chilcot report says this, before the invasion of Iraq, that invading Iraq would make terrorism worse. But he still did it because it was going to happen, because the hidden hand that controls him and controls Bush said it was going to happen. He talks about the catastrophe that's followed Iraq in the Middle East, being and what followed the invasion of Iraq in Iraq itself, the turmoil and violence that followed, and the internal strife and fighting. He tries to blame that on Assad in Syria. I mean, I do wonder for the man's sanity. I really do. And he talked about 9/11. Well, in a post 9/11 world, what he doesn't say, but he must know, surely, is that 9/11, the 9/11 official story makes no sense. There are groupings of pilots and groupings of building engineers, specifically who've come together since 9/11 to point out that the official story of the flying of those planes and the official story of how those buildings came down is nonsense. And the reason it's all nonsense is because it's a cover for the fact that that was an inside job. An inside job to create the problem, get the reaction from people, fear, hostility, do something, so they could offer the solution to the problem, which has been the war on terror. And the invasion of Iraq was justified through this whole war on terror scenario that followed 9/11. So he's saying in a post 9/11 world we were faced with this. No, 9/11 was created to justify the invasion of Iraq and these other countries and all this anti-terrorism, so-called military, these military operations around the world and in the Middle East. And he also talks about the fact that if Saddam had have stayed in power and the Arab Spring had come along, then he would have reacted to it in a very extreme way. Again, what Blair doesn't say, but he must know, is that the Arab Spring was totally manipulated to justify and to create a cover story to hide behind, picking off these countries on that original list of the project for the New American Century in September 2000. Who else was on the list? Libya. And of course, the Libya invasion and turning it into the desperate basket case it's become of violence was not done by Bush and Blair. It was done by Cameron and Obama and NATO. But even though they're different names and even though they're different parties, they're picking off countries on the same list going back to September 2000 because the hidden hand works through all parties. And so now, having done that to Libya, they go into Syria, which was also on the list for regime change. And Assad hasn't gone, which has caused them a lot of trouble and a lot of delay. But what you're looking at is this hidden hand pushing the world in a certain direction. And these puppets like Blair and Cameron and Bush and Obama, just front men to sell it and to implement it. And of course, someone like Chilcot isn't going to go into any of this stuff. So the Arab Spring, so-called spontaneous uprisings of the people, was all manipulated through organizations, particularly that are controlled by George Soros, the billionaire bag carrier for the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers. And so what Blair was doing in his response was to use as excuses for why he did what he did situations that were created by the very networks that wanted the invasion of Iraq. It's hilarious, but if you don't connect the dots, you can't see this. And let's not forget this very relevant point. The same people that told us there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were the very same people, not even the same agencies, the same people that told us the official story of 9/11. And we have now the mainstream media accepting that there were blatant, monumental lies told about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to justify that invasion. And yet, the same mainstream media accepts every detail of the official story of 9/11, which was given to them by the same people as gave them the story of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Another thing that Blair used to justify his actions was they were fighting Al-Qaeda. Well, a guy called Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, has admitted that he and the Carter administration funded, trained, and armed the so-called Mujahideen in Afghanistan to cause problems and threats to the Soviet satellite government in Kabul at the time, in the 1980s, in Afghanistan, to lure the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan to protect their government. And Brzezinski said they wanted to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam, quote. And of course it worked. A million Afghans died, but who cares to these people? And the long war in Afghanistan was massively influential in the fall of the Soviet Union. But the Mujahideen that were funded, armed, and trained by the Brzezinski United States and the Reagan-Bush administration after that went on to become Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And Robin Cook, a former Blair foreign secretary who resigned over the invasion of Iraq, actually said that Al Qaeda means the base because Al Qaeda was made up and created originally from those with their names on a CIA database of Mujahideen fighters, which they had funded, armed, and trained into being. It was extraordinary for someone who's researched this for decades, this whole hidden hand manipulation and direction it wants to go, to watch that Blair justification speech where he's pulling in all these things that have actually been created by those that controlled him to justify actions in Iraq. And he must know. So what he then did in this reaction was to then give the official story of the war on terror and started lecturing us on what should happen now after what he's done before. And we had the extraordinary sight then of the current British Prime Minister, David Cameron, standing up in Parliament to respond to the Chilcot report. And much of it was justifying US-UK invasions of countries, particularly towards the end. Because these people all answer to the same masters, the same web, the same network. And Blair is being protected from what should happen. He should be in a court of law, facing the consequences of his actions. Because those who serve the system are protected by the system. So in this same few days, you've had Blair protected by Chilcot, in effect, and protected from prosecution. And you've had Hillary Clinton protected from justified prosecution over these massive security breaches on her email server by the FBI. Because the FBI is an asset of the web, Hillary Clinton is an asset of the web, Tony Blair is an asset of the web, David Cameron's an asset of the web, and the British establishment in general is an asset of the web. So they all look after each other. And there are times, like with Chilcot and with the FBI, where the evidence that has come out against people is such that they can't just say, oh, no, there's nothing in it, because they couldn't get away with it. So they have a go at them. Oh, yes, this, that, and the other, but they don't go so far that these people get the comeuppance that they should be getting for their behaviour.